you. All right, so yeah, thank you so much, Nina, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and seeing some familiar faces and all the folks that I haven't met yet. So yeah, thank you very much, Nature Vancouver, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you this evening, and yeah, I'll speak for about just under an hour, and I have my timer here, so I'll do my best to keep on time. I know I generally like to riff off certain things as things emerge, so please, yeah, at any time, write down a question, and maybe Nina or Denis can facilitate some of these, and then at the end we'll have some discussion time for sure. So here, next slide. So yeah, just before I just want to reiterate Nina's blind acknowledgement. So yeah, all the work that the Invasive Species Council of Metro Vancouver does is on stolen and unceded territories of many First Nations across the Lower Mainland. Currently, I'm connecting from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I would also like to acknowledge that I grew up on the stolen and unceded territories of the Katzie, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo First Nations. And it's yeah, through this work I've been able to connect to many places, and many places which have been stewarded by Indigenous communities since time immemorial. And a portion of how I feel about this work is my role in tangibly having positive impacts in the environment that these people have stewarded and continue to steward to this day. So yeah, I hope we can all do what we can to continue that as we move forward, especially in this really, yeah, really interesting time in 2025. So and onwards. So yeah, there's just a quick agenda. So I'll give everyone an introduction to invasive plants / species. I should correct this to say species. I just noticed that now, but and then we'll talk about impacts, some priorities in the Lower Mainland, a bit of an overview of the management here on the South Coast, aka the Lower Mainland, and I'll share some tips and resources at the end too. And so yeah, we'll hit the ground running. So what is an invasive species? So essentially, an invasive species is a living organism that comes from one place in the world that then it gets established in another place in the world. And as a result of those introductions, they have significant negative impacts in the environment in which they are new to. This is what makes them different from, say, an introduced species or an exotic species, as those terms do not imply the significant negative impacts that they may have on a large landscape scale. So we're probably familiar with lots of plants that are considered weedy or difficult to manage, maybe in our gardens or in other areas in which we as humans take care of plants or animals. However, an invasive species is something that on the greater landscape level has a really detrimental effect if they are not taken into account and managed. And we'll get into kind of the variety of ways in which they have these impacts in a few minutes. And so we have some examples here that I can talk to later as we go on, but just an overview here on the bottom left, there's some English ivy that we're probably all very familiar with. We have a fire ant. We have some giant hogweed and an American bullfrog. And so these are all different examples of invasive species, and invasive species are quite abundant, I would say, in many parts of the world as a result of our current way in which our society works with the increased globalization. So that's a big factor in which we have increased spread of certain species, but we'll talk more about that later. And so next slide here. So I wanted to show something interesting, and something to think about as we kind of view these different organisms. So as you can see in the photo credit here, this is from the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative. And so if folks, some of you may know this plant, maybe can someone tell me what this plant is? Someone? This is with the yellow flowers here is skunk cabbage. And so skunk cabbage is a native species to our particular bioregion. It's a really important wetland plant here for a variety of reasons, and so this is an example of a native species from our part of the world that is invasive in another part of the world. So this is just my way of kind of like trying to introduce this concept that it really depends on the context in which these plants are distributed. It's not the plant in and of itself. So a lot of the invasive species that we have in our part of the world, they're either from Europe, maybe some of them are from Asia. I mean, all over the world, really. But that doesn't mean that the species that we have here aren't invasive in other parts of the world. So this is just one, very like minor example of this. And I'd also like to share very briefly that some of our native conifer species, so for example, lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, they unfortunately are invasive in Chile. And this is a result of the, well, not directly, but certainly had a big factor in this process, was the coup d'etat that happened in Chile in 1973. So there was a military dictatorship that was installed in Chile in 1973, and that essentially reverse engineered the nationalization of the Chilean forest industry, and so which led to the privatization of the forest industry. This privatization then led to multinational corporations, many of which being North American, to start plantations of tree species that are from our bioregion. And as a result, a lot of these trees have escaped the plantations, and now they're having very significant negative impacts in many of Chile's native forests. And so this is just one example of the really intense complexities and impacts that social policy and economic policy can have on our environment. I know that's a little bit outside of our scope of what we're going to be talking about, but certainly is something to consider, and things that we're kind of actively working on as a means to prevent the spread and reduce the impacts of these species. So I want to introduce this diagram here. So this is basically a graph that visualizes the steps in which a species is deemed invasive, and then subsequently what its impacts are. And so on the bottom we have the time scale, so going from left to right, and then on the other axis we have increasing distribution and abundance, so the amount of said species. And then subsequently we have on the top, we have the different stages in which land managers and that are taking in order to reduce said impacts, and what can be done at each stage. So currently, absolutely the most important thing in regards to reducing the impacts of invasive species is preventing them from establishing in the first place. So this is the pre-introduction phase. So this is when populations are very small, maybe they're single individuals or very small patches. Very small can depend on kind of the area that we're talking about, but it's essentially stopping it before it can get established even further. But please notice the time frame in which this happens, right? So and which is why prevention is so important, because as time passes, it's more difficult to take a step back into an earlier control method, right? So after prevention, we have early detection, rapid response. So say a species that's been established, it has a very small population. There's actually a means for these said species to be eradicated from the landscape, which is why they are denoted into this category. If there is not a successful eradication, the population continues to grow, and then we move into the control and containment phase. And this is also where, as you can see here, there's an actual increase of public awareness of said species. So more people in the community are able to identify it. Maybe there's people doing projects that are, working on said species. However, if those things don't continue to happen, the population continues to grow, and it gets into this post-expansion stage where there is just no option for eradication. There's basically no option anymore, and so therefore the said species is just now part of the landscape. But the thing is to try to control the spread so that it doesn't get into new areas. And so this is kind of true for a lot of the common invasives that we have in our region. So, if we name the most popular ones or the ones that are most abundant, rather, are, say, for example, English ivy, Himalayan blackberry, Scotch broom. Like, these are all examples of species that are in this ongoing management post-expansion phase. And then we can talk about other species that are in these previous sections, but I hope that makes sense. It kind of just describes kind of the process in which that informs what decisions are made in regarding to specific species or not. And so what are the impacts? So basically we have three main sections that I'll talk about. So we have ecological, health, safety, social and cultural impacts, and economic impacts. So on the next slide here, I have ecological impacts. So if folks didn't know, invasive species are the second greatest threat to biodiversity worldwide. And so this means that, yeah, a lot of the impacts that are had are basically quite varied, and it depends, really specifically on what species we're talking about. However, we can kind of talk about kind of general characteristics of what negative impacts on an ecological scale are as a result of the expansion of invasive species. And basically the top three would be the reduction in access to resources of said native plants in an area. And so we're talking about water, we're talking about light, and we're also talking about nutrients. Another impact is kind of from a trophic level. So there's a reduction in nutritional value. So if, for example, if we see in this photo here, there's this monoculture. So this single stand of purple loosestrife, and which is, looks quite striking and beautiful. Oops, what did I do? But it disappeared, but now here's, and so now these non-native flowers, they're not, the nectar that they produce is unfortunately not as nutritious as the diversity of native flora that are found in a given region. And so then that affects the complex interactions of other parts of the ecosystem, especially for insects, right? This is why Himalayan blackberries is a problem. I mean, it's one reason why it's a problem is because it's able to overtake an area where many fruiting species are able to grow. And so then therefore, when you have a monoculture of blackberry, it's all going to fruit, during the late summer. And there isn't going to be an opportunity for, say, for example, the other native rubus species in our region to to grow, and because they all have different fruiting timings, right? And so essentially, wildlife in an area will only be able to have access to food in this one specific time of the year. But obviously, you're not going to, want to have food only at one part of the year, right? You want to have food throughout the whole year. And so it's really important that that we reduce the coverage of said species, as these spaces can be filled with these other plants that fruit at these different times of the year. So you have food throughout the whole year, not just that one part of the year. And so, of course, invasive species have a really detrimental effect against species at risk. So a lot of native species, so especially animals, they've co-evolved with native plants for tens of thousands of years. And so when there is a displacement of these particular species, there's a loss of habitat and also a loss of food on just on a surface level, like of the negative impacts. And so therefore, if you have a diminished population of a certain species at risk, and you have an introduction of an invasive species, it's just going to be that much more difficult for those populations to stabilize as a result of these species invasions. A lot of species too also reduce water quality in a variety of ways. It's not so much like direct in the sense of like changing soil chemistry, for example. I mean, some do actually. I take that back. Some actually do change the chemistry of the soil, especially aquatic invasives, but also not in a chemical way. So, for example, if you have invasive species that have shallow root systems in a riparian area, so a riparian area is the area between land and water. When you have rain events or wind events, those areas are going to be more susceptible to erosion, which means that there are going to be more fine particulates that make it into water bodies. And if these water bodies are habitat for aquatic wildlife, these fine particulates are not actually very good for eggs, say, for example, of different fish. And so then therefore there can be a substantial increase in mortality of certain eggs as a result of the increased sedimentation in the water. And of course, as we know, very, very, currently, with the recent, forest fires and things of the like all over the world, unfortunately, invasive species do increase fire risk substantially. A lot of them are basically just standing fuel, waiting to be burned, and once they are lit, they really just take off, and a lot of there are some tangible impacts and results of this. So if folks remember the really big fires a couple of years ago in Hawaii, those were actually the result of the increased fuel load of an invasive grass species. So yeah, that's just like one example. And of course, this is all kind of a vicious cycle that we may or may not know, but we'll touch more about that as we go forward. And so some health and social impacts. So of course, a lot of invasive species, unfortunately, they are toxic to touch or to be ingested. So an example here is giant hogweed. So if you are in contact with this plant and you're not wearing adequate protection, potentially it can cause some really severe burns and irritation. So I'm going to show some photos. Content warning, it's a little bit scary, it's intense, but yeah, here's some like examples of some really nasty burns and rashes as a result of being in contact with said plants. There's another example here of some giant hogweed. A lot of times people are really impacted by allergens. So increase in pollen by, prolific flowering producing invasives, really make it challenging for people to be comfortable in outdoor spaces as a result of all of these pollens. And of course, like reduced visibility on roadways, especially if they're not maintained. So, it's a hazard for traffic and for folks working. If you can't see as well, you're going to make more mistakes and things of the like. There's potential erosion damage, on infrastructure, depending on the species in question, especially around the knotweed species. As you can see here, so this is some knotweed that is growing basically with no substrate from in some concrete. And so, yeah, there's been cases of knotweed in different parts of the world being able to fracture compromised foundations of buildings. And so which is why it's being actively managed, like really severely and actively here in the Lower Mainland, as there wants, you want to be able to protect like the things that make the rest of our society function. And so making sure that is managed is a high priority. And of course, there are so many other impacts, but a big one for Indigenous communities all across the world is the loss of traditional foods and medicine, not only from the actual impact of the establishment of certain invasives, but also access to these traditional foods and medicines. So, for example, if you have a huge stand of blackberry that hasn't been managed, and these blackberries are in basically surrounding an area in which communities would usually go to for foraging or other cultural uses, then that's also a negative impact as well. Economically, invasive species have a variety of different impacts. So specifically in agriculture, there's damage to crops and also a total reduction in the amount of things that can be made and grown. And this is a result of farmers having to spend more money on actually removing invasives from their fields rather than tending to them. And so, and it's also, so it's very labor intensive and it's very expensive to treat certain invasives. And so that just affects, the bottom line for a lot of people, and that can be kind of make or break for a lot of, small scale operations. And ultimately, then that means there's less, food available for us. Sometimes livestock can be poisoned as a result of the establishment of certain invasives, which then again reduces the amount of of goods that these livestock can produce, and also that it also can make them unsafe for human consumption. So that's also a big issue. In forestry, it really impacts plantations, and also like all of the other species that grow in a not in a plantation context. There's a lot of understory plants, and also other species like say fungi that need specific conditions to thrive. And so when you have disturbance events that lead to invasion, species invasions, and that part of the ecology is also negatively affected. In some cases, there's reduction in property values as a result, as you need to have a lot of resources to continue to maintain certain species from spreading. We have some infrastructure damage, as mentioned, and also access to infrastructure damage. So, which is why, for example, BC Hydro, it has a big invasive plant management program, as a lot of their hydro right-of-ways and control points are in these kind of like, these in these spaces where there are a lot of invasives as a result of the disruption of when these things were built. And so if they can't go in to maintain they're these specific areas, then it causes kind of like a cascading effect in other places, right? Recently, there's been a big, or recently, as in say last year, uh, there was a big announcement for Yoho National Park in Alberta. It was closed down as a result of the establishment of and detection of invasive virus. So yeah, some of these invasive species, um, they're not necessarily just plants and animals. They can be any sort of organism. And so yeah, they detected this virus called whirling disease in some water bodies in this park. And essentially, whirling disease it's very severe because currently there is no kind of like cure for water bodies that are infected by this virus. And essentially what it does, it affects freshwater fish. It infects them, and it basically, when a mother organism is infected with the disease, its offspring also get it. And when the offspring start to grow, like once they hatch from their eggs, for example, the fish are actually they can't grow in a I guess in a way that allows them to swim properly. It basically deforms their skeletal system, which therefore makes them start to whirl as they grow, which basically doesn't enable them to reproduce um, or to grow to past like a certain age, because the fish can't swim. And so yeah, the Yoho National Park was closed as a result of this detection, which basically has meant a lot of folks lost their jobs, and there's additional income that is lost as a result of people not being able to visit the park and all these things. So, and of course, management costs are very high. And so uh, basically, as governments at all levels are trying to manage invasive species in the best way they can, there's basically just less money for the other important things that we need in our society, right? So like education, access to healthcare, all the things that we need in order for us to live in a good way. But instead, some of that money is being used you know, to manage these invasives. And so this is a question for everyone. How much money on a global scale do you think is being spent on invasive species management? Any numbers? Any guesses? All right, well, 1 billion, not enough, that's right. $423 billion. This is from 2023. And so you can imagine, like on a global scale, if, this money was invested in anything really, we might have a slightly better world. So this is why it's kind of important that we kind of keep these things in perspective. And of course, we're doing all that we can within with the resources that we have to make sure that these are taken care of. But for context, in the Lower Mainland, and this data is kind of old. This is from 2016, but I just figured I'd share it with people because it's kind of interesting to think about in this way. And so you can see a kind of a breakdown. This is like from folks in Metro Vancouver. So this is kind of like these spending totals are basically like figures that include people who's includes their wages, includes cost of material for specific projects that are dealing with the control of these said species. And so there was an article from the CBC, or sorry, the Metro Vancouver back in 2016, and they quoted one of our board members, which is her name's Lori Bates Freimel, and she mentioned that there was just under $2 million spent a year being dealing with 11 key species in our region. And so Joe asks, what is Paris feather? Paris feather is an aquatic invasive, and we can, yeah, I have a slide that I can show you what that is later on. Yeah, that's right. So, where do they come from? So essentially, in my mind, there's two different vectors. So two different forms of introduction. So there's unintentional introduction, and then there's intentional introduction. And so unintentionally, and this, kind of goes back to the beginnings of, of contact of, how do I phrase this? So that it comes to the fact that, humans have always been in contact with other places in the world. There's always been constant movement of people and culture, regardless of the context. Whoops, sorry. And but especially now in, since the Industrial Revolution, where there's just been, a huge increase in the way and the ways and the capacity of like exchange of goods, kind of makes it just a prime example of like how different species are able to establish themselves across the world, and at the rate in which they are able to. So one example locally is that the port of Vancouver. So in our backyard, it's the biggest port in Canada, and it's the third largest port by the amount of material it receives in North America. And so essentially we're on the basically on the front line of receiving material from all over the world that that potentially can be carrying new species of invasives that that ecologists and scientists don't necessarily know about. Of course, in light of this, there's the screening processes and the surveillance around around these things are, much different than what they were, say in the 50s. But even then, there's still a bit of a bottleneck in how much material can actually be surveyed and surveilled before things are transported from one place to another. So that's kind of one way in which, different species are able to get to new places. Once they are established, they can start to hybridize with other species. So essentially what that means is that they make a new variety just kind of on their own, because these plants, some plants are very similar to one another in terms of their genetic makeup. And so then they create a new species, which then kind of they inherit kind of the characteristics of these species that make them invasive in the first place, and kind of like ramps them up even higher. So it just makes them harder to remove. They're more resilient to way more different environmental conditions and things of the like. Of course, the horticultural industry has played a big role in this too. Like a lot of the best-selling horticultural plants are, unfortunately, they're invasive, right? I mean, in the end, people buy them because they're easy to grow and they don't need much maintenance. But unfortunately, there's kind of there's a lag time between knowing what specific species are invasive in the context of these other industries in which they're trying to produce profit by selling plants. And so intentionally, though, there's definitely there are cases where people are introducing certain species for specific reasons. A lot of invasives are used in, say, like remediation projects, so to stabilize slopes or to fix nitrogen in soil. But this is like kind of before knowing that these species then would have a negative impact in the years later. So an example of this is Himalayan blackberry, not for the reasons I mentioned just now, but for agricultural production. So the person who brought Himalayan blackberry to North America was basically breeding it to create very juicy and big berries. And so, but little did you know that then this species would then, escape, and then now it's basically part of the landscape now in North America of like how expansive its range is. Of course, there's like, aesthetic reasons and why, invasives are planted in new areas, like especially, when, the European colonization happened here, like a lot of the plants that we, are familiar with that are invasive, they were brought, from people's like, homelands to bring them a sense of comfort and ease in a new place. And of course, none of this was, thought of to have a negative impact back then, in the early 1800s. The first kind of like study of, I guess, this concept of invasion. I guess there's a little bit of dispute around who the first kind of like people are, and I guess in the Western scientific perspective. Some people say it's Darwin, Charles Darwin. He kind of writes about these different dynamics in his earlier works. But then there was a fellow in 1950, forget his name right now, but basically started kind of like created the subdiscipline of biology, which is now known as invasion biology. And so since the 50s on, there's been, much more study in regards to like, what classifies an invasive species, what impacts do they have, what makes it invasive, how many species out of, say, the many that are introduced around the world, why are only some of them able to establish themselves, and then how many of those are actually become invasive. All of that is kind of like in the field of invasion biology. And actually here, before I go forward, there's some other vectors. So, of course, this is some common periwinkle that's, you could buy at a garden store. So unfortunately, there's a lack of updated legislation for the purchase and of the buying and selling of, invasive plants, especially, and also other organisms. Soil can be another vector. There can be lots of seeds of different things in compost mixes and soil mixes. Without cleaning equipment properly, especially if they're doing treatments of invasive species, that can be another way in which things are spread. And also sometimes they're even embedded in other plants. So even sometimes in native plants, they can have different invasive propagules in them. And yes, of course, hiking boots, definitely a big one, especially if people aren't cleaning their boots before going from one place to another. That's another way in which these propagules are spread. And of course, wildlife too. There are also ways in which wildlife, especially birds, are able to spread invasives, especially if they're berry producing. So those are just a handful of examples. And so, of course, all this being said, now with, in the light of the climate crisis, it kind of exacerbates these issues even further, which makes it even more important to do what we can to reduce, the amount of spread that can be that is possible. And so, long story short, the warmer temperatures mean there's like a longer growing season for certain species. A lot of invasives are actually quite drought tolerant, and so having drier conditions actually just makes them want to grow even more. And also on the flip side, there's plants that love more water, and which makes them grow even more. And when there are more extreme weather events, means there are more disturbance events. And disturbance events just means like, when there's a significant change in the landscape. So a forest fire or a big windstorm that knocks down a bunch of trees, like there's exposed soil. All of this can lead to immediate changes to these environments, which allow for the germination of say dormant invasive propagules or the establishment of propagules from other sources in these kind of recently disturbed areas. Sea level rise is also another component of this, especially for water-loving plants, which we'll talk about very shortly here. So, but before we go there, it's like, what are the solutions, right? So, I mean, we kind of talked a little bit about these, but essentially prevention is the number one thing that we can try and do in regards to the, reducing the impact, the negative impacts of invasives. And then, but we also, once they are established, we do have some control and management, methods are under our belt that are, have been tried and true and have been shown to work. There's a big burgeoning field of ecological restoration that, a lot of folks are embarking on. It's becoming quite a popular field, and that's really promising. And of course, education, having presentations like this, talking to your friends about these issues, all of this makes it possible for these issues to become less and less impactful in our society and in our environment. So I'll just give a quick overview of some control methods. So of course, we have our manual mechanical. So, someone pulling, with their hands or with tools, which, I guess will be happening this weekend with Nigel and crew. So that's great. There's also chemical options too. Unfortunately, a lot of the really high priority species, they have to be treated with chemicals as a result of their just of how good they are at growing and spreading, and there really isn't other effective ways for them to be managed efficiently. So that's another option there too. And there's biological control, and then there's also cultural control. So I'll talk a little bit more about biological control just in case folks aren't familiar. But essentially, it's the use of a different organism that is targeting a specific invasive. I see some questions here, so I'll finish this slide here and then I'll get to those. And so these control agents, basically they're researched quite extensively before they're implemented into a specific landscape. And so in this picture, we have a stand of purple loosestrife. And so this is and they implemented this weevil species. And so after 1 year, you can kind of see the reduction of the weevils, the reduction of the flower heads of this loosestrife as a result of the weevils basically eating them as they go through their life cycle. And then by 10 years, basically you wouldn't have known that there was purple loosestrife like in this area because the weevils did their job really well. And essentially there's like decades of research that go into the possibility of doing these set introductions. There was quite the unfortunate kind of series of disasters and kind of the early stages of this of this method of control. Like in Australia, for example, there's lots of literature around that, but now it's becoming a little bit more. It's certainly way more rigorous in regards to like what is done and to make sure that things like this can be implemented and certainly can be highly effective. And one quick example is this fly, so the Istochera alderici. So this is kind of like a trial. It's basically an experiment to control Japanese beetle. So this is like a very specific predator for Japanese beetle. Like this fly can only finish its life cycle by laying its eggs on Japanese beetle. And so right now there's some trials being done to in the Lower Mainland that are releasing these flies, and they're actually finding that the flies are doing its work. They're actually laying the eggs on Japanese beetle and killing them. So that's kind of interesting. So yeah, I know I'm getting close to my time. I've been speaking for 45 minutes. I have a lot of material to cover still, but maybe I'll answer these questions and maybe we can just have a discussion based on like what I kind of been sharing. I know I kind of gave some really kind of high level examples of things, and if people have specific questions, I'm happy to take them now. Oh, Denis, I'm welcome to go to the full hour. Okay. Let's see. Is my screen still sharing?
Yes.
Oh,
So there's a question. Did somebody import all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays to North America?
I'm not sure of the specific birds that they're referring to, but yes, there have been many intentional introductions of bird species all over the world, and a lot of them are now considered invasive in the respective areas in which they were introduced. Yeah, that definitely has happened. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, definitely.
Does the chemical management harm native species as well as the
So that's a really good question. So it depends on like kind of how you look at it, but generally no, like their chemical treatments in the context of invasive species management is done in a very specific way. And a lot of the especially the modern chemicals are actually, and I don't know the specifics on how this is even possible. It's kind of beyond my comprehension, but essentially a lot of these chemicals are actually highly targeting to the specific invasive that it is trying to manage. So no, there and also there's when you're doing this work on the landscape level, like you're using the least amount of product to manage certain uh, areas, and so there's actually, and a lot of them are not persistent, which means that they're applied, say like onto the leaves of say Japanese knotweed, for example, and the product then goes into the plant. There's just enough product that goes into the plant to kill the plant, and then the remaining active ingredient actually just stays within the plant and it doesn't go into the surrounding soil because it's just enough that's been applied to stop the plant's like reproductive method. So there's
Mm-hmm.
so there's that. Yep.
So I'll just insert a question of my own. So for instance, the fields of purple loosestrife,
Yes.
what happens to the weevils once they've been introduced and there are no more purple loosestrife plants to feed on?
Yeah. So the research that is designed so that basically as soon as the weevils are done their job, they basically just die off because they don't have their food source.
Okay.
So these agents are basically are chosen because of this very specific task that they're able to do. Because once their food source is gone, then they're not going to be hunting other similar species, and so then they also just die off in the environment.
And so in that whole tone again, Kevin's iPad question, would love to hear more about the research that goes into biological controls to prevent disasters. Everything is so complex, it seems like it would be hard to know all of the downstream impacts of introducing new species.
No, absolutely, Kevin. I mean, yeah, it like I was saying, like it's definitely outside of my wheelhouse in regards to like all the specific things that go into that said research. But I was talking to a specialist at a meeting just before the new year, and I was asking him a bunch of questions. And basically, they do a bunch of lab trials for over 10 years before they even consider doing a test trial in a specific area. And so they basically do all the numbers and be like, okay, so we're gonna use well, first of all, they have to test if the specific agent is going to be only targeting certain the target species, and so they'll put them in a lab together is basically what this person was saying. And like say like this fly that I was showing everyone. I can go back to it. Yeah, they basically put this fly in a lab, and they try to see if it's gonna like lay its eggs on beetles that are related, kind of like biologically to Japanese beetle, or if it will like lay eggs on other plants and things like this. And so, and then again, like I was mentioning, it's super rigorous. I mean, yeah, I think the only just now they're doing these trials after I think over 12 years of research, like in labs and running simulations and things of the matter. And so, yeah, of course, it's incredibly complex, but that's why that so much, precision and rigor is being done on behalf of the governing bodies to make sure that these are even feasible to be implemented in the real world. I do have some other resources that and things that I would like share. So maybe I can just quickly
Yes,
go through them, if that's
yes,
okay.
please do. Please do.
And so, yeah, of course, Kevin. And so, yeah, essentially in locally, provincially, we're speaking to now, like there is a piece of legislation. So it's like in the law that land managers are obligated to manage invasive species like on crown land, so for example, for public land. So this is the BC Weed Control Act. So anyone can take a look at this. And so the thing that is kind of the bottleneck for folks doing this work is that the BC Weed Control Act is actually kind of old now. It's like I think the last time it was updated was in the 80s. And so there are a lot of species that are considered invasive and are having substantial impacts in our region. But the legislation is just too antiquated to kind of catch up with all of this. And so, and this is why people are still able to buy and sell invasive species, because there's actually just no like laws around not doing that. So, and so, yeah, it's kind of like unfortunately, it's kind of a political issue that has yet to be, concretely and explicitly resolved. However, there is this piece of legislation that is allowing for all this work to be done on provincial, land, and that's a whole other kind of presentation in itself. But that's the kind of the long story short. And so every year, so I guess before I talk about this is that provincially, the government body that is in charge of invasive plant and invasive species management, well, it's twofold, both the federal government and the provincial government, and of course the local government. But the provincial government, so the Ministry of Forests, they have this resource that they put out every year, and this is kind of like a ranking of priority invasives. And so this is the 2023 top 25. However, there hasn't been any changes from 2023 to 2024. And there is going to be an update in February for the new ranks for 2025. But it sounds like there won't be any significant changes as things have kind of stabilized. And so this is kind of like the top 25 in terms of like what is being actively treated. And this is all it's all accessible on the provincial website. So you just type in province of BC invasive species. They have a whole landing page that kind of talks about all of this in greater detail. So if anyone's interested, please check that out. We also have links to this on our website too, and we'll be updating as we get the updates from the province. And so this is just thing about names. Of course, we have our scientific name. So it's really good to know when we're talking about specific plants, if you're able to find a botanical name, that's the scientific name rather. That's really great. Of course, because a lot of common names can vary depending on what region you're in. And of course, indigenous names and local names are incredibly important because there's actually a lot of additional knowledge that's already embedded in the names in indigenous languages for a lot of plants. And so that's one thing that is becoming a big field of research and that people are encouraged to look into as well. Unfortunately, I don't have the indigenous names of the plants that I'll be showing here, but just because I don't know which ones to put because there's so many names, because like the language families of our region is so rich. And so, but that's something that I'll be trying to work on, as I do more of these presentations. I think it's really important for us to start being acquainted with them in that way as well. We all know, and I'll go through these really quick. Maybe I'll just go through the ones that maybe aren't that are kind of new to people. But of course, Himalayan blackberry, the big one we talked about, English ivy, English holly, lesser celandine. So this is kind of a relatively new one. I think there's a lot of in Trout Lake, kind of like near the south part of the parking lot. We're kind of working on a new resource for this, and I'll kind of skip through that to the end. But we have some Scotch broom here, green canary grass. You can see it's like a really, it really grows well around water. Really loves water. We have yellow flag iris, yellow archangel, Paris feather. So this is for you, Joe. Paris feather. This is like an aquatic. So the big thing about this is that it kind of grows on top of water. So essentially, it camouflages water, and so it can be a tripping hazard. So like someone can think like, oh, like this is just like a bunch of grass, and then you like step over into where the feather is, and you fall in the water because it's growing like right in the water. And also, it's a big problem for irrigation channels and water infrastructure. So it'll grow like right into mechanisms and make it so that it's they're not able to operate properly, which then causes like kind of black flow and backflow issues, especially in agricultural communities where there's a constant regulation of water for specific activities. Eurasian milfoil is another aquatic invasive. This one, unfortunately, changes the chemistry of water, so it will actually deoxygenate water. So it'll remove oxygen from the water, which makes it not possible for other species to grow. Tree of Heaven. So this is going to be a new one, kind of a versioning one. In the next few years, as it's the host species for this invasive insect. So this is in the bottom right here is the spotted lanternfly, and so this is a big issue in the eastern United States right now, and basically people are saying like, yeah, we gotta be ready for when it comes on the West Coast, and since we have its its native host plant outside of its native range, it can be it can be quite a severe issue. So I'm trying to get some more information, and I'm trying to get some folks to talk about this at our upcoming events, because definitely something to be on the lookout for sure. Oh yeah, Chelsea. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry to hear that. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, it's definitely one of those. But yeah, hopefully in the next couple years we'll have some more resources for people, because we definitely want to be proactive about this one. This is a Japanese butterbur and a common butterbur. So these are in the Pedicites genus. So they're very similar but different. The number 6 priority right now in the province. So yeah, it has these really big kind of like umbral leaves. You know, Joe and will remember we worked on a lot of this in Renfrew Ravine. And we've got a lot of it. I hope it's still not doing like that great in regards to like the other plants being able to establish and grow, but definitely did a number on it. And of course, the knotweeds. I sincerely apologize. Definitely went through things very slowly, and I have so much stuff, but I'm just gonna go to the very end, because I want to show people kind of what we are doing. So essentially, all levels of government are working on things like this, to make sure that we're doing the best that we can. Here at the Invasive Species Council, we have our resources that are open to everyone to consult. So basically, our main project right now is we're developing best management practices for regionally important species. And so right now we're working on three new ones. Currently, we have 26 of them available on our website, and they're all free, open access. So please, if you're curious about how to manage specific invasives, like in your home or in other areas that you're wanting to do work in, please consult those, because it's a compilation of local research from academic research, and also from folks doing on the ground work that are showing and sharing their knowledge around how to manage these in then basically the most efficient way and possible. And it kind of gives specific information of like disposal methods, like what are the best methods to use for specific plants. It's really comprehensive, and certainly folks will learn a lot from them. So please take advantage and use them to the best of your ability. One thing too, it would be great for everyone to know about this. So this is the Provincial Report Invasives app. So it's a phone application, but there's also a page on the provincial government's website. So if you see invasives like in and around, please take the time to report them. All this information is super helpful for people that are doing management on the ground, and so every little bit counts. So please, I highly encourage people to do that. If you're wanting to learn about plants in general, on our website we have this list of plant apps, and so it kind of gives you a list of things that you can try out, so you can learn more on your own. Of course, when you're gardening, try to make sure that you're getting weed-free sources. And again, on our website, we have resources for people that are wanting to garden in a plant-wise way. Again, so as I mentioned, of our best management practices, we have access to the Grow Green Guide. So if you're looking to replace invasive species from your garden with non-invasive, non-native plants, or native plants, this is a good starting point too. And also we have lots of volunteer events throughout the year. So we're just kind of in the midst of scheduling things. We do work in Burnaby, we do work in Delta and New West, and hopefully in Vancouver someday too. And yeah, that's all I wanted to share with everyone. If there's any specific questions people have, you all have my contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions at any time. So yeah, thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating. I'm trying to make my audio behave itself. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Adrian.
My pleasure, Nina.
You've given us so many thoughts and ideas. My mind is bristling with ideas at the moment. One of the thoughts I have is next month we have Nancy Turner coming. She's an ethnobotanist.
Whoa, you got Nancy Turner to come present for
Yes,
you all? That's amazing.
Yes, yeah, she's coming in person. She's going to be.
No way.
Yes, February 13th. You better come and attend, and you can have a chat with her
Holy
and
smokes.
find the names of the
Cool.
different plants. Yeah, we're pretty excited about that.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, kudos to you for doing that. That's amazing. Yeah, she's a living legend, so to speak.
So
Adrian, I have a question for you.
Publicize it too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, please.
Adrian, I have a question for you. What about
Yes.
disposal of invasives that we are collecting from our own properties?
That's a great question. So let me just stop sharing my screen, and while I talk to you, I'm gonna look something up.
And the reason I ask is I'm with used to be with the Crippen Park Stewardship Group, the Weird Warriors.
Yeah.
We used to work in the park.
Mhm.
And we have stopped, well, we stopped when they required us to put the plants the invasives that we were removing in clear plastic bags. We had to cut it all up and put it in clear plastic bags for disposal. And the Daphne laurel in particular had to also be put in a clear plastic bag, but it was going into the landfill in the plastic bag. And we all said, no, we're not going to be putting any more plastic in the landfill. Before we
Yeah.
used to just put it on a tarp and the parks guys would come around and collect it up and supposedly put it into the proper waste stream, or else put it into the fire pit.
Yeah, more unfortunately, yeah, a lot of the plants material, they do still need to go to the landfill, but the landfill, it doesn't go with everything else that is processed at the landfill. There's actually a separate, facility in which they deal with invasive plant material. So I just kind of put in the chat here this document from Metro Vancouver Regional District rather, and it gives you all of the specific information around where you can bring invasive plant material.
Okay,
So,
very good.
so please make use of that
Okay,
if
a
that's
couple
useful
of
for
other
you.
comments is the Metro Parks people are doing a good job in the park. I guess people have seen the pink tags they've been putting on the holly. So they're doing a systemic herbicidal treatment of the holly. So that's good because there's way too much of it in the park. The other one that's really a problem is, especially on the east side of the island, is the Daphne laurel, which is quite a difficult plant to handle because a lot of people are allergic to touching it, but it needs to get out of there because it has a lot of berries that the birds seem to take and spread around. And it also doesn't
100%.
allow anything else to grow under it.
Absolutely. So yeah, I just linked here the link of our website that shows you all of the best management practice guides and the fact sheets.
Yep.
So please, everyone, yeah, take note, or you can just Google it, and it will come up. So I will say that right now we're in the process of updating the current ones that we have. So there are some broken links, and there's kind of been some change in the species information. And so right now we're working on updating all of these, and the updated 2025 versions should be public by March at the latest, I believe. And so, and then as I mentioned earlier, we're working on 3 new guides for different species, so new species that haven't been covered. So I can tell you all that we're working on lesser celandine best management practice, and for butterbur, so Japanese butterbur, and for common butterbur, and for brown marmorated stink bug. So be on the lookout for those, most likely in probably April, May, that they'll be kind of like out. But yeah, if you follow us on our social media, or if you sign up for a newsletter that's on our webpage, yeah, we'll let everyone know once those are published and ready to go.
I have a couple of questions about invasive species and rapid response. I was glad to see that wild chervil is number 8 on the list, because it's certainly one that I wasn't familiar with until about 3 or 4 years ago, and it seems to be spreading at just a phenomenal rate, and especially in South Vancouver and Richmond along the rail line. So I'm curious what the management kind of rapid response practice is for that. And then another question that I've had for years is, why don't the parks concentrate on removing the fruiting female holly trees, which would at least slow the spread and buy time to work on eradicating the males and the immature plants. No place I've been do they seem to be prioritizing removing the fruiting holly.
Yeah, so for the chervil question, I believe that the technique that the province uses is a mix of mechanical and chemical treatments. However, I will say like the amount of staff that the province has to manage all of these is, unfortunately not as big as they would like. I mean, they are hiring some more people. So that's going to be a great thing this year, that there's going to be some more people on the ground doing more of this work. But yeah, there's just only so much that can be done in any given year, just based on, the amount of material and amount of plants and other species that, are currently occupying space. And so, yeah, there's always going to be areas where they're, unfortunately won't be treated. But that being said, the areas that are being treated are high priorities for specific reasons. Whether it's next to First Nations territory, or if it's right next to a public area where there's more vector for spread. Like there's a lot of factors that that make those areas specific targets for control and eradication. And in regards to the holly trees, that's a really good question. I don't really know the specific answer, but I will say that it's most likely a budgetary thing. So a lot of the taller holly trees, they actually need to be felled by an arborist, and arborist time is expensive, and so that's probably the reason why they're not doing that, to be honest. And also there's a bit of a trade-off, at least what I've seen from people, like kind of just having conversations around, people actually will keep taller trees around even though they're invasive, because having a taller tree is kind of good in some ways. Like there's a bit of nuance there, like so, like the tree may be giving you some shade, like if it's next to your house, or if there can be a variety of reasons.
But I'm thinking in places like Pacific Spirit Park and
Oh,
Central Park. I'm thinking
yeah.
parks that they're not removing the fruiting female trees, which is the main spread, and it kind of seems if you at least cut those down, you'd buy yourself some time for the others.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wish I could give you a specific answer, but I unfortunately I'm not part of those conversations. But I will say I think it's just a resource thing, like it is really expensive to hire someone to then to do that specific work, because under the law they have to be felled by an arborist, and so there's kind of more work that needs to be done rather than getting a crew of people to to weed around like kind of the smaller plants. I would say that at this point, as in terms of like a bottleneck of like what is being done or what isn't.
And is there any way for the public like to find out what the plan is for something like, say, wild chervil, or like if there's kind of is a plan under this body that you mentioned, or is that only stuff for people who are part of that?
No. So that's a really good question. I mean, so provincially, there's a database called, it's been rebranded / revamped. It's called Invasives BC. And so it's a database that's managed by the provincial government. And right now it's more or less just used by land managers. But however, there is going to be a public facing map that will be developed that will show what species are where and what treatments have been done on them. But it's because there is it's a very new thing. Like so it used to be called the Invasive Alien Plant Program. But now it's been basically, this system is being revamped and it's now called Invasives BC. And they're still kind of developing the public facing map. There's actually still a lot of work that is being done even for the land managers' use. So even things like how to upload data and how all that is managed. So but yeah, apparently it's being worked on it, and it will be something that is available to the public once it's ready.
Great. I have a quick question about the tree of heaven. You said is a host for a butterfly. You showed the butterfly. Do you happen to know its name?
Yeah, so it's the host plant of spotted lanternfly.
Spotted lantern fly.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Because I've been watching a tree of heaven that's now gone. It's growing in a neighborhood's yard in a yard in the neighborhood, and it's now gone under the road and it's coming up the other side, which of course is a typical thing for a tree of heaven to do. So now I've got a little bit of extra weight to
Yeah, for
go in
sure.
that direction.
For sure.
Yeah. Well,
I saw a question from Chelsea, and I'll try to answer it the best way I can. I mean, it's a big question. It's complex, but so how does the province determine, how do us as a province prioritize prioritizing removal? Well, essentially it's depends on like on the ranking. So I guess there are some plant sizes I showed in the kind of in that flow chart. So there's, plants that are, are able to be eradicated versus not, essentially, if we're kind of simplifying it. So the priority is to be able to actually manage the plants that are actually able to be eradicated, because that means that you prevent a whole subset of species to become issues like say to the ones that we are commonly aware of. So for example, like Himalayan blackberry, English holly, English ivy.
Oh, that's the one.
So basically, you want to do as much as you can to prevent new species to becoming as prolific as those ones. But it also really just depends on the area, the specific site that we're kind of like that people are looking at. Maybe it's because there's a greater chance that it could be spread by, for example, I don't know, people walking by, or if it's a toxic species and it's in a publicly accessible area, like you're gonna want to manage those species rather than in some really remote area where there's much less likelihood of someone actually going there and getting hurt as a result of it. So yeah, there's a lot of factors, but it really just depends on the specific site and kind of like what the management goals are. But generally on the provincial level, I mean, I don't work for the province, like my organization is one of the regional invasive species organizations, so we just work alongside them, but we don't have any specific say on what they do or don't do. But certainly they're trying to do as much as they can to do the best work that they can given the resources they have. So they have to prioritize depending on, all these different factors.
Oh, I also wanted to say how much I appreciated the slides that you showed at the beginning and the point that native plants from here in other parts of the world are serious invasives, and so we remember that it's not that there's anything wrong with the plant, it's in the wrong place where it becomes a problem. And I also
totally
appreciated your kind of making the point that, there's a difference between introduced plants and invasive plants, and that there's, tens of thousands of introduced garden plants that never become a problem invasive, or they may not ever be a problem. Like for instance here, rhododendrons are grown in, millions of gardens, and they're not an invasive problem. But in Britain, there is a species of rhododendron that's a serious invasive. So it's not that every introduced plant is an invasive. It's really only a very small percentage that become real problems.
Yeah, totally. 100%.
Well, I think it's time we let you go, Adrian. We have much appreciated this talk. Everybody has stayed on forever, and we'd like to give you a big thank you very, very much.